The silencing, when judicial power meets political resistance. This is Karoline Now, where we bring you the unfiltered truth behind today's most consequential political confrontations. If you value transparency in our institutions and accountability from those in power, stay with us until the end of this episode. Remember to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments below as we expose the realities that mainstream media won't touch. In the austere quiet of Courtroom 7B, the air hangs heavy with tension. Judge Edward Hardgrove's gavel cracks against wood, not merely calling for order, but wielding authority like a weapon. Today's target stands unflinching at the defendant's table, Karoline Leavitt, whose presence in this courtroom represents more than just another case on the docket. It represents a collision of institutional power and political resistance playing out in real time. The court will not tolerate interruptions of this nature, Hardgrove declares, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality that so often masks deeper biases. But beneath the veneer of procedural objectivity lies a more complex truth, one that would begin to unravel in precisely 4 minutes. The judiciary, designed as our democracy's impartial arbiter, has increasingly become another battlefield in America's ideological civil war. Judge Hardgrove's chambers, adorned with the traditional symbols of justice, scales, blindfold, sword, stand in stark contrast to the partisan reality unfolding before the gallery of watchful eyes. Leavitt, no stranger to political pressure after serving in the crucible of Washington's power structures, recognizes the moment for what it is. Not simply a legal proceeding, but a test of whether those associated with certain political allegiances can receive fair treatment within a system ostensibly built on equality before the law. Your Honor, she begins, each syllable measured with the precision of someone who understands the weight of this moment. I believe the record should reflect exactly what transpired. It's this assertion, this refusal to accept selective silencing, that triggers what political observers would later call a cascade of revelations. The judge's attempt to cut her microphone only amplifies her message across social media channels and news outlets within minutes. As Leavitt continues her statement, despite the judge's increasingly urgent demands for silence, the tension in the courtroom crystallizes around a fundamental question. Can judicial authority legitimately suppress political speech when that very authority may be compromised by undisclosed conflicts of interest? The gallery watches as Hardgrove's complexion shifts from judicial stoicism to visible discomfort. What begins as an attempt to control his courtroom rapidly evolves into a revealing moment of institutional vulnerability. 4 minutes after Hardgrove's initial admonishment, an aide hurriedly approaches the bench, passing a folded note that would irreversibly alter the trajectory of the proceeding. The judge glances down, his expression fracturing, as the first threads of his carefully constructed judicial empire begin to unravel in public view. The note, whose contents would later become public record through unprecedented legal challenges, contained information about financial connections between Hardgrove and entities with direct interests in silencing voices like Leavitt's. Connections that should have been disclosed, connections that should have resulted in recusal. Across America, the reaction splits along predictable fault lines. Conservative media portrays Leavitt as David facing the judiciary's Goliath, a lone voice of integrity, challenging a system riddled with concealed biases. Progressive outlets question her motives, suggesting the confrontation was orchestrated to undermine institutional credibility. But beneath these partisan interpretations lies a more fundamental concern shared across the political spectrum: the erosion of trust in institutions once considered beyond reproach. When judges cannot maintain even the appearance of impartiality, the very foundation of justice itself begins to crack. What we're witnessing, notes one legal analyst observing from the gallery, isn't just about one judge or one case. It's about whether our system can still function when those entrusted with its maintenance appear to operate by different rules. As news cameras capture Hardgrove hastily calling for a recess, the public witnesses something rarely seen in courtrooms: the visible crumbling of judicial composure, the mask of impartiality slipping to reveal the human and potentially compromised figure beneath. Leavitt remains standing, her posture reflecting not triumph but resolved determination. This isn't victory. It's merely the first revelation in what would become a weeks-long excavation of judicial impropriety, reaching far beyond this single confrontation. In the hallway outside, reporters swarm like antibodies to an infection in the body politic. Questions fly. Was this planned? Did you know about the judge's connections? Will you pursue sanctions? But the most important question remains unspoken. If this judge's integrity could be so fundamentally compromised, how many others sit on benches across America, rendering decisions shaped by undisclosed interests and affiliations? As the courthouse doors burst open, and the story spills into the public square, one thing becomes clear. This confrontation has opened a door that cannot be closed. Behind it lies a network of influence and power that has operated in the shadows of our justice system for decades. When Courtroom 7B reconvenes tomorrow morning, it will no longer be just Leavitt facing judgment. The entire apparatus of judicial accountability now stands before the bar of public opinion. And as documents continue to emerge from whistleblowers inside the court system itself, the question becomes not whether Judge Hardgrove's empire will completely crumble, but how many other chambers of power will fall with it. In our next segment, we'll examine the paper trail leading from Hardgrove's chambers to financial interests spanning 3 continents and involving figures at the highest levels of political influence. The story of corruption doesn't end with one judge's gavel. It merely begins there. The fracturing of justice, when authority collides with accountability. The marble floors of the federal courthouse reflect the fluorescent lights overhead, casting harsh shadows across Courtroom 7B. Here, in this temple of American jurisprudence, the nation's most fundamental promise, equal justice under law, faces its most revealing test in a generation. Judge Edward Hardgrove commands the bench with the practiced authority of a man who has never had his wisdom questioned. His black robe, once a symbol of impartiality, now appears more like armor as he stares down at White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, who stands resolute at the defendant's table. Counsel will refrain from these provocative lines of questioning, Hardgrove declares, his knuckles whitening around his gavel. The gallery shifts uncomfortably, sensing the tremors of something unprecedented taking shape. Leavitt's presence in this courthouse represents far more than a routine legal proceeding. It embodies the widening fault line between institutional power and democratic accountability, a fracture running beneath the foundation of American governance itself. "Your Honor," Leavitt responds, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "the public has a right to understand the full context of these proceedings." The judge's eyes narrow. Those who have observed Hardgrove through his 15 years on the federal bench recognize the subtle tells of his mounting anger, the slight flush creeping up his neck, the tightening at the corners of his mouth. "Ms. Leavitt," he cuts back, "you serve at the pleasure of the administration, not as an arbiter of what this court will and will not permit." The subtext is unmistakable to everyone present, a judiciary increasingly unwilling to be questioned, particularly by representatives of an administration it views with thinly veiled contempt. 3 rows back, a legal journalist from The Atlantic scribbles furiously in her notepad. This moment, this collision between the judicial and executive branches, transcends the immediate legal questions at issue. It illuminates how institutions meant to check and balance one another have instead calcified into opposing camps. "The record will reflect," Leavitt continues, refusing to yield, "that this court appears to be applying a different standard than was applied in comparable cases before this very bench." A murmur ripples through the courtroom. Hardgrove strikes his gavel once, twice. Each crack against wood, a desperate attempt to maintain control of a narrative, rapidly slipping from his grasp. "The court will not be lectured on consistency by the White House press secretary," he snaps, voice rising above judicial temperament. What happens next occurs in 17 seconds of real time, but will play on news networks for weeks to come. Hardgrove rises, face contorted with an anger no longer disguised by procedural formality. His hand, the same one that has sworn in witnesses and signed landmark decisions, swings forward in an arc of judicial impropriety so shocking that the court reporter's fingers freeze mid-keystroke. The sound of skin against skin silences the room. For 3 heartbeats, no one moves. Leavitt's cheek bears the red imprint of judicial overreach, but her eyes never waver. In this frozen moment, the power dynamics of American democracy are laid bare for all to witness, raw, unfiltered, and irreversibly altered. 4 minutes later, as if orchestrated by the invisible hand of political karma, a court clerk approaches the bench with a manila envelope. The timing could not be more cinematically perfect, nor the consequences more profound. "Your Honor," the clerk whispers, audible only to those nearest the bench, "these documents were just delivered by the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility." Hardgrove's face drains of color as he reviews the contents. The gallery watches in real time as a judicial career built across 4 decades begins to implode. The documents, later revealed through Freedom of Information requests, contain evidence of financial entanglements between Hargrove's family investment vehicles and corporations with active cases before his court. Cases where he consistently ruled against public disclosure, against regulatory oversight, against the very transparency Leavitt now demands. "This court stands in recess," Hargrove announces, his voice hollowed by the recognition of what awaits him beyond the courthouse doors. No explanation offered. None needed. As he retreats to his chambers, cameras capture what court artists cannot: the visible disintegration of institutional authority when its moral foundation crumbles. On the courthouse steps 30 minutes later, Leavitt addresses a hastily assembled press corps. The mark on her face has faded, but its imprint on the public consciousness has only begun to form. "What happened today isn't about me," she states, looking directly into the camera lenses that will carry her image to millions. "It's about whether we still believe that no one, not even a federal judge, is above the law." By nightfall, #judicial accountability trends nationwide. Court watchers and legal scholars excavate Hargrove's history of rulings with newfound scrutiny. Cases closed years ago suddenly appear in a different light. Decisions that once seemed merely conservative now read as potentially compromised. Senate Judiciary Committee members from both parties issue statements expressing, quote, "deep concern" and promising hearings. The Chief Justice remains conspicuously silent, trapped between institutional loyalty and the judiciary's increasingly fragile public legitimacy. As the sun sets on this watershed day for American jurisprudence, analytical frameworks struggle to capture what viscerally registers with citizens across ideological divides. They have witnessed not merely a powerful man losing his temper, but the mask of institutional infallibility slipping to reveal the all-too-human frailties beneath. In the days to come, investigators will follow the paper trail from Hargrove's chambers to a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. They will uncover connections to political operatives, corporate interests, and foreign entities that challenge the very notion of an independent judiciary. But today, this exact moment, marks the beginning of a reckoning that extends far beyond one judge's career. It raises questions fundamental to democratic governance. When institutions fail their essential purpose, who guards the guardians? And what remains of the rule of law when those entrusted with its protection become its most privileged violators? As darkness falls over the courthouse, its neoclassical columns stand like sentinels from another era, a time when faith in institutions remained unshaken by evidence of their corruption. Tomorrow, these same columns will frame a different America, one awakened to the urgent necessity of reform. In our next segment, we'll examine how a network of judicial appointments across 3 administrations created a pipeline of ideologically aligned judges whose financial disclosures reveal troubling patterns of conflict and concealment. The slap that echoed through courtroom 7B may have been directed at Karoline Leavitt, but its reverberations will be felt throughout the entire federal judiciary for years to come. The fallen gavel, when justice strikes back. The echoes of Judge Hargrove's hand against Karoline Leavitt's cheek reverberate beyond courtroom 7B, transforming from a singular act of judicial misconduct into a seismic event that threatens to collapse an entire ecosystem of entrenched power. Within moments of this unprecedented breach of decorum, the White House press secretary's team springs into action with the practiced precision of political operatives who recognize a pivotal moment when it erupts before them. In the courthouse hallway, Leavitt stands surrounded by her communication strategists, the red imprint on her face now documented by courtroom sketch artists, whose renderings will soon dominate cable news chyrons across America. Her voice, steady despite the assault, instructs her deputies, "This isn't about me. This is about the system that made him believe he could do this with impunity." By nearly sunset, her team has meticulously assembled a dossier on Judge Edward Hargrove, not merely his judicial record, but the intricate web of financial entanglements his family has cultivated over 15 years on the federal bench. The slap, it seems, has torn away the veil of judicial temperament to reveal something far more insidious: a pattern of rulings that consistently favored corporations with direct financial ties to investment vehicles controlled by Hargrove's family trust. We've identified 17 cases where the judge ruled in favor of entities his family holds significant positions in, explains a Justice Department whistleblower, speaking on condition of anonymity to Leavitt's chief of staff. The pharmaceutical case last year alone, his ruling blocked disclosure requirements that would have exposed pricing practices for a company where his wife's hedge fund holds a 12% stake. On Capitol Hill, the tremors intensify. The Senate Judiciary Committee, that body tasked with the confirmation and oversight of federal judges, convenes an emergency session behind closed doors. Partisan divisions momentarily dissolve in the face of such a flagrant abuse of power, replaced by the institutional self-preservation instinct that occasionally transcends political tribalism. What we're looking at here, says a senior committee staffer, documents spread across a conference room table, is potentially the thread that, when pulled, unravels a tapestry of judicial appointments across multiple administrations. Hardgrove isn't an isolated case, he's merely the most visible node in a network designed to capture the judiciary for private interests. Meanwhile, in newsrooms from Washington to New York to Los Angeles, editors scramble to recontextualize years of reporting on Hardgrove's decisions. Stories once framed as battles over judicial philosophy are hurriedly recast as potential conflicts of interest. Legal analysts who previously praised the judge's originalist consistency now question whether his constitutional interpretations might have been guided less by James Madison than by his personal portfolio. Leavitt, for her part, navigates this unfolding drama with a strategic discipline that belies her relatively brief tenure in Washington's power circles. She refuses multiple invitations to appear on primetime news programs, understanding that personalizing the story around the physical assault would diminish its institutional significance. Instead, she authorizes a single written statement. When those entrusted with defending our Constitution resort to physical intimidation, they reveal not strength, but the profound weakness of their position. By midnight, the first digital fingerprints of Hardgrove's financial empire begin emerging in specialized legal publications. Banking records obtained through sources in the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network reveal a sophisticated structure of shell companies, with beneficial ownership traced to family members and associates of not just Hardgrove, but 5 other federal judges appointed during the same administration. What we're witnessing, explains a former Securities and Exchange Commission investigator now working with Leavitt's team, is how judicial capture actually works in practice. It's rarely about direct bribes. It's about creating a class of jurists whose personal financial interests align perfectly with the outcomes sought by certain litigants. In the pre-dawn hours, as Washington sleeps, algorithms detect unusual activity patterns across social media platforms. Coordinated networks of accounts, many traced to entities previously identified as foreign influence operations, begin crafting counter-narratives suggesting Leavitt provoked the assault. This digital mobilization reveals the stakes at play. Hardgrove's potential downfall threatens not merely one judge, but an entire architecture of influence. By sunrise, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court issues an unprecedented statement announcing an administrative review of Hardgrove's conduct and financial disclosures. The carefully worded document, bearing the formal letterhead of the nation's highest court, contains a single sentence that signals the gravity of the situation. The integrity of our judicial system requires not only the reality, but also the perception of impartiality in all proceedings. As morning breaks over the Capitol, Leavitt reviews intelligence briefings indicating that servers housing Hardgrove's financial records in 3 offshore jurisdictions are being systematically accessed and potentially purged. The race to preserve evidence begins, with Justice Department officials seeking emergency preservation orders in multiple countries. This is how power protects itself, observes a veteran prosecutor seconded to Leavitt's task force. When exposure becomes inevitable, the priority shifts to containing the blast radius. But containment may prove impossible. As we'll explore in our next segment, the digital breadcrumbs leading from Hardgrove's chambers extend into the darkest corners of judicial influence, revealing how a system designed as a check on power has itself become a mechanism for its consolidation. The question is no longer whether Hardgrove's empire will crumble, but how many other seemingly impregnable institutions will collapse alongside it. The architect of justice, how a courthouse assault exposed a corrupt network. Ethan Carter's manila folder lands on Karoline Leavitt's desk with the weight of a gavel. Inside lies not merely evidence, but the architectural blueprints of judicial corruption, meticulously documenting how Judge Edward Hardgrove transformed his chambers into the command center of a shadow empire. Every ruling has coordinates, Carter explains, his voice barely above a whisper as he traces financial flowcharts linking Hardgrove's family trusts to corporations that repeatedly appeared before his bench. These aren't coincidences, they're coordinates on a map of influence. 4 days have passed since Hardgrove's palm struck the White House press secretary's face in courtroom 7B. The physical mark has faded, but its repercussions continue to fracture the foundations of Washington's power structures. What began as a spontaneous violation of judicial restraint has evolved into something far more consequential. The first visible crack in an edifice of corruption that spans 3 administrations. The financial architecture is elegant in its complexity, observes a former federal prosecutor now advising Leavitt's team. Hardgrove isn't merely compromised. He's a node in a sophisticated network designed to weaponize judicial authority against democratic oversight. As dawn breaks over the Potomac, Leavitt convenes a war room in the West Wing. The evidence assembled by Carter reveals that Hardgrove's financial tendrils extend beyond his own chambers, implicating a cadre of federal judges whose appointment histories suggest not ideological consistency, but financial allegiance. We've identified transfer patterns through Cayman entities that align perfectly with the timing of major corporate litigation, explains a Treasury Department analyst, sliding documents across the conference table. The transactions themselves are legal, but the timing suggests advanced knowledge of judicial outcomes. What makes this revelation particularly explosive is not merely the corruption it exposes, but how it recontextualizes years of judicial decisions that have systematically dismantled regulatory frameworks, environmental protections, and consumer rights. Decisions once defended as constitutional originalism now appear as calculated instruments of financial self-interest. The judiciary was supposed to be our last firewall against the corruption of democracy by concentrated economic power. Leavitt tells her inner circle, her voice steady, but edged with controlled fury. Instead, it's become the primary mechanism for that corruption. By midday, digital security experts detect coordinated efforts to scrub electronic records from servers in Luxembourg, Singapore, and the Bahamas jurisdictions, where Hardgrove's family trusts maintain sophisticated financial structures. The digital destruction carries the fingerprints of professional intervention, suggesting resources beyond those available to a single federal judge. They're burning the evidence, Carter concludes, watching in real time as database access logs spike across multiple servers. Which means we're closer than they can afford us to be. On Capitol Hill, the institutional response fractures along predictable partisan lines. The Senate Judiciary Committee, initially united in condemnation of Hardgrove's physical assault, now splinters as the financial implications threaten to engulf judges appointed by administrations from both parties. Calls for transparency clash with warnings about undermining judicial independence, a principle invoked not to protect impartiality, but to shield corruption from scrutiny. What we're witnessing, explains a constitutional scholar consulting with Leavitt's team, is the tension between institutional self-preservation and democratic accountability. The system is designed to resist precisely this kind of scrutiny. Leavitt, for her part, navigates this unfolding crisis not merely as a victim seeking redress, but as a strategist, recognizing a pivotal moment to expose systemic corruption. She authorizes limited intelligence sharing with selected journalists, understanding that public exposure represents the only force powerful enough to overcome institutional resistance. The judiciary has insulated itself from democratic accountability through norms of professional solidarity and institutional deference, she explains in a secure briefing to senior administration officials. Breaking that insulation requires extraordinary circumstances, which Hardgrove has inadvertently provided. By nightfall, the first detailed exposés appear in legal publications, documenting the intricate financial architecture behind Hardgrove's empire. The reporting reveals how judicial rulings followed investment patterns with mathematical precision, creating a perfect alignment between Hardgrove's financial interests and his constitutional interpretations. In response, a coordinated counteroffensive emerges across traditional and social media platforms, attempting to reframe the narrative around Leavitt's alleged provocation of the judicial assault. The sophistication of this response, involving both domestic commentary and foreign-linked digital manipulation, reveals the stakes at play and the resources being mobilized. They wouldn't deploy these assets if we weren't close to the core, Carter observes, analyzing the digital fingerprints of the counter-narrative campaign. This isn't about protecting Hardgrove anymore, it's about protecting the system he represents. As midnight approaches, Leavitt receives intelligence that 3 other federal judges implicated in Carter's investigation have initiated emergency communications with financial advisors in offshore jurisdictions. The dominoes have begun to fall. What happens next, Carter warns as he updates the evidence binders, will determine whether our judicial system can still function as a check on power, or has become entirely captured by it. The battle lines are drawn. In the coming days, Leavitt will need to transform a momentary physical assault into sustained institutional accountability, challenging not merely one judge's conduct, but an entire ecosystem of judicial capture that has operated in the shadows for decades. The question is no longer whether Hardgrove's empire will crumble, but whether the foundations of judicial integrity can be reclaimed from the ruins. The architecture of power, when judicial authority meets its reckoning. The manila folder lands on Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt's desk with the quiet gravity of a bomb before detonation. Inside lies not merely evidence, but the architectural blueprints of a judicial shadow empire, a system of influence so meticulously constructed that it remained invisible precisely because it operated in plain sight. A public hearing room in Washington, D.C., the air conditioned to an uncomfortable chill. Leavitt approaches the microphone, her composure a stark contrast to the tumult of the previous week. 4 days have passed since Judge Edward Hardgrove's palm struck her face in courtroom 7B, a momentary lapse of judicial temperament that has unwittingly pulled at a thread threatening to unravel decades of institutional corruption. What we present today, she begins, her voice steady, is not merely about a judge's momentary failure of restraint. It's about the systematic weaponization of judicial authority against democratic oversight. The evidence, assembled by investigator Ethan Carter, displays on screens throughout the chamber. Financial flowcharts linking Hardgrove's family trusts to corporations repeatedly appearing before his bench. Database records showing transaction patterns through Cayman entities perfectly aligned with major corporate litigation outcomes. Digital security logs revealing coordinated efforts to scrub electronic records from servers across 3 continents. Every ruling has coordinates, Carter had explained during the preparation. These aren't coincidences, they're navigational markers on a map of influence. The hearing room falls silent as Leavitt methodically presents the evidence. This isn't partisan theater but the surgical exposure of judicial capture, a phenomenon long suspected but rarely documented with such precision. What makes this revelation particularly explosive is how it recontextualizes years of judicial decisions that have systematically dismantled regulatory frameworks, environmental protections, and consumer rights. From the back of the room, James Whitaker rises. The former federal prosecutor turned corporate counsel represents not merely his clients, but an entire ecosystem now threatened with exposure. This is a dangerous attempt to undermine judicial independence, he declares, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 3 decades in courtrooms. Ms. Leavitt's presentation amounts to nothing more than conspiracy theories designed to distract from her own behavior in Judge Hardgrove's courtroom. The confrontation crystallizes the fundamental tension at play: institutional self-preservation versus democratic accountability. Whitaker invokes judicial independence not to protect impartiality, but to shield systemic corruption from scrutiny. Leavitt's response cuts through the procedural objections. When judicial independence becomes a shield for financial self-interest, it no longer serves the Constitution but subverts it. The room erupts in controlled chaos. Journalists furiously take notes. Congressional staffers whisper urgently into phones. In the gallery, citizens witness what few Americans ever see: the moment when institutional power recognizes it can no longer contain a truth too consequential to remain hidden. Beyond the hearing room, the digital battleground ignites. A coordinated counteroffensive emerges across traditional and social media platforms, attempting to reframe the narrative around Leavitt's alleged provocation of the judicial assault. The sophistication of this response, involving both domestic commentary and foreign-linked digital manipulation, reveals the stakes at play and the resources being mobilized. We've detected transfer patterns through offshore entities that align perfectly with the timing of major rulings, explains a Treasury Department analyst, testifying under oath. The transactions themselves are technically legal, but the pattern suggests advanced knowledge of judicial outcomes. In this moment, Leavitt transforms from victim to architect of accountability. She navigates this unfolding crisis not merely seeking personal redress, but recognizing a pivotal opportunity to expose systemic corruption that has operated beyond democratic reach. Whitaker approaches during a brief recess, his voice lowered to ensure privacy. "You have no idea what you're unraveling," he warns, his usual confidence replaced with something closer to desperation. "This goes beyond Hardgrove, beyond politics." "I know exactly what I'm unraveling," Leavitt responds, meeting his gaze directly. "A system that was never supposed to exist in a constitutional democracy." By day's end, intelligence reaches Leavitt that 3 other federal judges implicated in Carter's investigation have initiated emergency communications with financial advisors in offshore jurisdictions. The dominoes have begun to fall. The judiciary was supposed to be our last firewall against the corruption of democracy by concentrated power, Leavitt tells reporters gathered outside. Instead, parts of it have become mechanisms for that corruption. As night falls over Washington, Carter updates the evidence binders. New information flows in from financial intelligence units, tracking unusual activities across banking systems used by Hardgrove's network. The battle has only begun. challenging not merely one judge's conduct, but an entire ecosystem of judicial capture that has operated in the shadows for decades. The foundations of Hargrove's empire have begun to crumble, but the architect himself remains ensconced in power. The coming days will determine whether this moment represents a genuine reckoning or merely a temporary disruption to a system designed to absorb and neutralize threats to its continuity. In the West Wing, lights burn late into the night. What began with a judge's loss of composure has escalated into a constitutional confrontation that will test the resilience of America's institutions and the power of public exposure against entrenched corruption. The question is no longer whether Hargrove's empire will fall, but how many institutions will be transformed in its collapse, and whether American democracy will emerge stronger from the ruins. The empire unraveled, how a single moment of judicial misconduct exposed decades of corruption. In the wake of judicial violence, a different kind of justice now emerges, one that operates not through gavel strikes, but through the relentless exposure of truth. Judge Edward Hargrove's suspension hangs like an incomplete sentence in the American judicial narrative, a pause rather than a period in this unfolding constitutional drama. Karoline Leavitt stands at her kitchen window, dawn breaking over Washington as she reviews security protocols for the third time this week. The physical assault she endured in courtroom 7B has metastasized into something far more ominous: systematic intimidation designed not merely to silence her, but to erase the evidence she continues to unearth. The threats started coming within hours of the documents becoming public, explains Thomas Reed, the former intelligence officer now coordinating her security detail. They're not random trolls. The linguistic patterns and deployment methods suggest coordinated action from entities with significant resources. The manila folder that first landed on Leavitt's desk has multiplied into digital archives stored across secure servers on 3 continents, a distributed insurance policy against the growing pressure to bury this investigation. Each document represents another strand in Hargrove's web of judicial corruption, a network so vast that its exposure threatens not merely individual careers but entire institutional paradigms. What makes this particularly dangerous, explains constitutional scholar Elaine Merriam, is how Hargrove's network operated at the intersection of legal authority and financial power, creating judgments that appeared jurisprudentially sound while systematically favoring specific corporate and political interests. The threats against Leavitt have expanded to include her family, a tactical escalation designed to exploit personal vulnerability. Her parents, living in New Hampshire, have been placed under protective surveillance after suspicious vehicles were repeatedly documented near their home. Her brother, a high school teacher, has received cryptic messages referencing his daily schedule. "They want me to understand that everyone I love is within their reach," Leavitt explains during a secure briefing, her voice steady despite the implicit menace. "This isn't about intimidating me anymore. It's about making me choose between truth and the safety of my family." The machinery of institutional self-preservation has fully engaged. 3 federal judges implicated in Carter's investigation have filed emergency motions questioning the constitutionality of the inquiry itself, a procedural maneuver that would, if successful, classify the evidence as inadmissible in any future proceedings. Meanwhile, financial records tracking suspicious transactions have mysteriously disappeared from Treasury Department servers, despite multiple redundancy protocols. What we're witnessing, explains former Justice Department Ethics Counsel Rebecca Harrington, is the immune response of a captured system. When institutions that exist to provide checks and balances have themselves been compromised, they deploy formidable resources to prevent their own accountability. As Leavitt prepares for the second round of hearings, the battle lines have clarified. This is no longer about a single judge's misconduct, but about whether American democracy retains sufficient antibodies to fight off the infection of systemic corruption. The judicial empire that Hargrove helped construct over decades operates like a shadow government, one that renders decisions not based on constitutional principles, but on a complex calculus of financial and political interests. "We're not just fighting individuals," Carter explains during a secure briefing in the congressional SCIF. "We're fighting an operating system that has been running in the background of American democracy for years." Pull one thread, and you start to see how judicial decisions, regulatory outcomes, and market movements have been choreographed with devastating precision. For Leavitt, the personal has become inextricably political. The handprint that Hargrove left on her face has faded, but its implications continue to reverberate through the halls of power. She has transformed from press secretary to something far more consequential, a democratic antibody fighting against institutional capture. "I never asked for this fight," she acknowledges during a rare moment of reflection, But having seen what I've seen, stepping back would make me complicit in something that threatens the very foundations of our government. As night falls over Washington, Leavitt reviews her testimony for tomorrow's hearing. The evidence binders contain not merely documentation of corruption, but a map of American democratic vulnerability. What happens in the coming days will determine not just Hardgrove's fate, but whether the system he represents can continue to operate in the shadows. They're afraid, Carter observes, noting the escalating desperation in the countermeasures being deployed. Systems like this depend on invisibility. Once exposed to democratic sunlight, they begin to lose their power. The battle lines are drawn not between left and right, but between transparency and secrecy, between democratic accountability and institutional capture. As Leavitt prepares to continue her testimony, the question that hangs in the air is not whether Hardgrove's empire will fall, but how many Americans will recognize the true nature of the fight, and whether our democratic institutions retain sufficient integrity to deliver justice when those entrusted with upholding it have become its greatest threat. The road ahead remains treacherous, but in this moment of national reckoning, one truth emerges with crystalline clarity: power concealed is power unaccountable, and the greatest threat to American democracy has never been external enemies but internal corruption, operating under the cloak of legitimate authority. As we observe Leavitt's determined preparation for tomorrow's testimony, we must ask ourselves, how deep does this judicial corruption truly run in our democracy? And can a system designed to protect itself from accountability ever truly be reformed from within? Thank you for joining us for this revealing installment of our investigation. Like and subscribe to Karoline Now for continuing coverage, as we follow this unprecedented battle against judicial corruption and the brave individuals risking everything to expose the truth.